the reason for Hanukkah. Why do we, as Talmudim of Yeshua, celebrate Hanukkah? That is a question that I've often been asked. And my answer is that Hanukkah is an annual reminder to us that how Yahweh delivered his people of Yehuda from the tyrannical Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes, who made an attempt at annihilating the religion of Yehuda and turning them all into Hellenists. So why did Yahweh, having destroyed the first temple, return his people to Yehuda, to the land of Yehuda, after the Babylonian exile? Now he's rescuing them from Antiochus IV and restoring his second temple. The only reason was so that Yeshua could be born in the city of David in Bethlehem, as it had been prophesied. But was it necessary to save the second temple when Yahweh did not even dwell in the holiest place in that temple? Hopefully, by the end of this brief journey through the history of Hanukkah, the Hanukkah story, we'll have a better appreciation of what has been completely ignored by the Gentile world and by the Jewish sages, not considering it worth inclusion in the third portion of the Tanakh, alongside the story of Esther and Purim. So why did they not put it there? So why would such an important event in the history of Yehuda not be recorded in Tanakh? After all, the book of Esther tells the story of how Yahweh saved his people, Yehuda, from physical annihilation at the hands of the Medo-Persian Empire at the time of Purim. This time, Yahweh saving his people and his own land from spiritual annihilation, and that is the story of Hanukkah. The only reference in Scripture regarding the celebration of the festival of Hanukkah is found in just one verse in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22, which says, "Then came Hanukkah in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Yeshua was walking around inside the temple and in the area of the Solomon's colonnade." This one verse in the whole of Scripture gives no indication why Hanukkah was being observed in the time of Yeshua. As there are no other records of the event in Scripture, we had to turn to the book of Maccabees. That is why our reading this morning was selected from the first four chapters, which cover a small portion of the overall narrative. So I will aim to explain the narrative and cover more of the wider picture of the events leading up to and following the restoration of the temple. The celebration of the 8 days of Hanukkah took place in 164 BCE as part of the rededication of the temple following the 3-year war against the Seleucid army of Antiochus IV. The period when all this occurred is known in the English-speaking world as the Intertestament period. Even though the celebration is not mandated in Scripture, it is yet another opportunity for us to praise Yahweh for having protected his people against the onslaught of the Gentile world. As we saw through our readings, if Yahweh had not enabled that small guerrilla army led by Yehuda Maccabee to conquer that mighty force of Antiochus, the temple of Jerusalem would have remained in a desolate state, and the people of Israel, the people of Yehuda, would have been forced to adopt the culture and the pagan practices of the Seleucid Hellenists. Hanukkah is an important celebration because it helps us to see how the sovereign plan of God was being worked out during those silent years of Israel, a period that lasted from Alexander the Great to the end of the life of Herod the Great. Now, the celebration of Hanukkah also helps us to appreciate the subtle ways in which the adversary has constantly worked against Yahweh and against Israel throughout its history. Let's look at Alexander the Great. Our readings showed the events that led up to Hanukkah began with his conquest of the Middle East. After he had gained control of Years of Isra'el, he allowed the people of Yehuda to continue practicing their own religion in accordance with the commands of Torah and Yahweh. However, as generations passed, many of the elite in Jerusalem became deeply enamored with the newfound culture of Hellenism. Then in 175 BCE, open conflict broke out between the high priest Onias III, who was opposed to Hellenism, and his son Jason, who favoured Hellenism and the Seleucids. A period of political intrigue followed, with both Jason and Menelaus, the brother of Onias III, who separately bribed the king to win the position of high priest. The result was a brief civil war in Yehuda. Jason and Menelaus tried to outbid each other for the role of Kohen HaGadol under the rulership of Antiochus Epiphanes. However, it must be remembered that it was never the prerogative of any king, and more particularly a foreign king, to appoint the role of Kohen Gadol. The command of Torah gave us strict guidelines on who could be placed in that role. However, Jason and Menelaus put their personal ambitions ahead of the responsibilities for the people and their roles on behalf of Yahweh. So enamored with the Hellenistic way, Jason built a gymnasium for public games close to the temple and encouraged his fellow Kohanim to attempt to reverse their circumcision so that they would be accepted in the Hellenistic life and could compete in the Greek-style games. As a direct result of that flagrant disregard for the priestly role, and conflicting high priests caused an ever-widening gap between the priesthood and the common people. Antiochus took full advantage of this situation by imposing his constant desire to bring all Yehuda into line with the rest of the Hellenistic Empire. Around the time Antiochus lost the war against Egypt, it happened because of the intervention of Rome. So he had to turn round and head homeward, with his army in disarray and without payment for their services. Aware of the wealth that was stored in the treasury at Jerusalem, Antiochus took advantage of the civil unrest in Yehuda and sacked the temple, stripping it of its gold and silver and all the equipment, including the 7-branch menorah, and cleaned out the treasury, laying it to waste both for the people and the livestock and all things around the city. He finally headed back to his capital city, Antioch. We got a snapshot of how the conditions were during those 3 years when the temple lay in a desperate state. We also saw how there was constant pressure upon the people of Yehuda to capitulate and follow the culture of Hellenists. Many other nations had been subjected to the tyrannical powers of Antioch, but Yehuda was different. Their religion was set apart from any other nation in the empire. So the religious differences, therefore, became the focal point of Antiochus's rage. As we read, he required the Kohanim to profane the altar and sacrifice pigs, forbade the gathering of people for the observance of Shabbat and the Moedim, and killed any mother with her baby if she had had her son circumcised on the 8th day. All these atrocities and many more lasted for a full 3 years while it fought for supremacy over the mighty Seleucid army. Finally, at the hand of Yahweh, the Seleucid army was overpowered by Yehuda Maccabee and his small army of faithful followers. It was certainly not by might nor by power, but by the Spirit of God that the war was won by Yehuda. Mattiyahu, the priest from Moedim, the father of the 5 Maccabean brothers, together stood against that mighty Seleucid Empire. They were supported by others who became dissenters, standing against the Seleucids. Later, after their victory, they entered Jerusalem, triumphant, and ritually cleansed the temple, re-establishing traditional form of worship and installing Jonathan Maccabee, the 5th brother, as the high priest. following the death of Antiochus, his commander became preoccupied with the internal affairs of the Seleucid Empire. So he finally agreed a political compromise with Yehuda and restored the religion and freed the people of Yehuda to go their own way. It was during the cleansing of the temple that, according to the rabbinic tradition, the victorious Maccabees found one cruse of oil. It remained uncontaminated with an unbroken seal from the former high priest. However, we are not told how it came to be a 9-branched Hanukkah in the place of the original 7-branch menorah. That was the one that had been carried off by Antiochus and his troops. All we are told in 1 Maccabees 1:21 is that the sealed cruse only contained enough oil to sustain the Hanukkah for just 1 day. However, it miraculously lasted for 8 days, by which time further oil could be produced under the seal of the new high priest. So let's look at the quiet years that followed that restoration. Immediately following the rededication of the temple, the community was once again divided about their future. When the 5 Maccabee brothers realized how successful they had been, many decided that because of the support of Yahweh, some should continue with the revolt to liberate the Jewish residents in other regions under the control of Antiochus. However, not all were keen to continue fighting against the Seleucids. So following the death of Yehuda Maccabee in a battle in 160 BCE, he was first succeeded by his younger brother Jonathan as the commander and also as the new high priest. Jonathan brokered a treaty with various nations and communities, causing further dissent between those who desired religious freedom and those who sought greater powers through continued war. Then 18 years later, in 149, Jonathan himself was assassinated by Typhon, a pretender to the Seleucid throne. Jonathan was succeeded by his last remaining brother, Simon Maccabee. Simon gave his support to Demetrius II, the contemporary Seleucid king, who in return exempted Maccabees from having to pay any further tributes. However, Simon was also murdered in 134 BCE by his own son-in-law, Ptolemy, and was succeeded by a high priest and king by his son, Hyrcanus I. The death of Simon brought an end to the generation of Maccabees who'd fought the battle. So began a new generation of joint priests and kings in the land of Yehuda. But that was not in accordance with the commands of Torah. Yahweh had always been very clear that at no stage were the priesthood and the civil rulership to be blended together. The destruction of the first temple saw the end of the Davidic kingship in Israel. Then when the people of Yehuda returned from the exile, they were meant to always be only princes who were the civil rulers, making Yahweh himself the king over Yehuda. The priesthood was also to remain in the line of succession from Aaron and his descendants. However, by the time John Hyrcanus I succeeded his father Simon, it appeared neither the ruler nor the priest consulted the Torah, nor did they consult Yahweh. When earlier priests, such as Jason and Menelaus, had acted as Cohen Gadol, their role had not been established in accordance with the Torah. They had never consulted Yahweh, but rather their appointments were made by the overlord, Antiochus himself. So Yahweh being king over Yehuda was far from the minds of these men. They were all self-seeking and lived far from the teachings of Torah. That same pattern continued throughout the era of the Hasmonean dynasty, which ruled independently right up until 63 BCE, when the Roman general Pompey intervened in what was a Hasmonean Civil War, making Yehuda, the land of Yehuda, a client kingdom of Rome. Now I mentioned the Hasmonean Civil War, which according to Josephus came about because of a breakdown between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because the Pharisees opposed expansionist wars, while the Hasmoneans, which had seen Hyrcanus conquer Transjordan, that is east of the Yarden River, along with Samaria, and more importantly, Idumea, which was known as Edom. So having conquered Edom, Hyrcanus forced them to convert to Judaism. As Josephus tells us in Antioch, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Hyrcanus subdued all the Edomenes and permitted them to stay in the country if they would be circumcised and make use of the laws of the Jews. They were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers that they submitted to the use of the circumcision and the rest of the Jewish ways of living. Hyrcanus created a major problem for the future people of Israel, of Yehuda and Israel. Past history showed that his people should have been warned about trying to convert the descendants of Esau. At no stage in history of Israel had Esau, the twin brother of Yaakov, ever truly forgiven him for having stolen the birthright. As we read recently in Parashah 6, Toldot, the hatred of Esau developed and nothing ever changed. Even when Yitzhak was giving the firstborn blessing to Yaakov, Esau still hankered after the firstborn position in the family dynamic. That same struggle has kept surfacing at various times throughout the history, and now Hyrcanus is trying to forcibly adopt the men of Esau, or Edom, into the tribe of Yehuda. When Yaakov gave his fourth son Yehuda the blessing as the future leader of the family, that would have increased the hatred harbored by Esau towards Israel. Now we see Hyrcanus is giving Esau an equal place in the family of God. Having forcibly circumcised them, it really and truly incensed the Pharisees. They demanded that the next Hasmonean king, Alexander Jannaeus, the son of Hyrcanus I, choose either to be a king or a high priest. Instead of making a choice, he opted to keep both roles. Provoked, of course, a civil war within Yehuda. That was only brought to an end with the intervention of Rome through Pompey in 63 BCE. That began the Roman period of Jewish history. Enter Antipater and Herod. Following the conquest of Pompey in 63 BCE, the internal governance of Yehuda was placed in the hands of Hyrcanus II. He was the grandson of Hyrcanus I, with again a dual role as priest and, this time, ethnon, which is a vassal king. However, the actual power was in the hands of his advisor, Antipater, who was an Edomite. He was from Idumea. Now, over the next 23 years, the internal rulership of Yehuda vacillated between Hyrcanus II and his blood brother Aristobulus II. Also, Hasmonean Empire, away to the east, was actually rising to its zenith, and it was challenging Rome for supremacy over all these eastern regions, including Years of Isra'el. So in the midst of all these intrigues that ensued between the governance roles of the Hasmonean dynasty and Rome, Antipater the Idumean took advantage of these circumstances. Now, Josephus says on this issue, in 47 BCE, Caesar appointed Antipater as the first Roman procurator, allowing him to promote the interests of his own house, that is, the house of Edom. Caesar appointed Hyrcanus II to be high priest and gave Antipater whatever position he chose. He left the determination to Antipater himself, because he made him procurator over Yehuda. In turn, Antipater appointed his two sons to positions of influence. Phasael became governor of Jerusalem, and Herod became governor of Galilee. That led to increasing tensions between Hyrcanus and the family of Antipater, culminating in the trial of Herod for supposed abuses of his governorship, which resulted in Herod fleeing into exile in 46 BCE. However, Herod soon returned and honoured Antipater's father and continues his former governance. Hyrcanus was so incapacitated and weak, he was unable to challenge this new rise of Herod. But he challenged Herod before the Sanhedrin and even before Mark Antony. The latter stripped Hyrcanus of his nominal political authority and title and bestowed them upon the accused, Herod. Herod subsequently was designated by Rome King of the Jews. That happened when the Senate sat in 40 BCE. So began the tyrannical rule of Yehuda by Herod the Great, who worked under the Roman title that he'd been given, and he forced the people of Yehuda into submission under his tyrannical rulership. However, the sovereign plan of God will never be thwarted. Just 1 year before the death of Herod the Great, the real King of the Jews was born in Bethlehem, as had been prophesied. Herod knew that the days of his dynasty were numbered. In failing to have killed Yeshua as an infant, as he tried to do in Bethlehem, meant that Yeshua would bring an end to Edomite rule. So in conclusion, we have seen that Yahweh did not intervene in the battle. If he had not intervened in the battle between the Seleucids and Yehuda, his people would have slowly been assimilated into the Hellenistic culture of Antiochus, and of course Rome and the rest of the Western world. Again, we see how by completely ignoring the teachings of Torah and allowing Yehuda to rule jointly as both king and priest, brought about the demise of the Hasmonean dynasty through its own internal strife. As we read earlier from the words of Josephus, it was Caesar who appointed Antipater as the first Roman procurator. That came about because the Hasmoneans had forced the Edomites to be circumcised and adopted into Yehuda. By that action, the Hasmoneans had paved the way for the Edomites to take control of the people of Israel. Rome's appointment allowed Antipater to promote his two sons to be governors, and of course, the one from Galilee later became Herod the Great, who was given by Rome the official title of King of the Jews, right there within the community of Israel itself. It's no accident that Yeshua was born just 1 year before the end of Herod's reign of tyranny, making it clear to Herod that he was the real King of the Jews. He had been born in Bethlehem in the line of King David. So we can also see that having rejected Yeshua as their Mashiach, the sages did not want the story of Hanukkah included in the scriptures, because if they had put it in there, they would have been forced to recognize the real King of the Jews. The Christian church has also failed to acknowledge Hanukkah by instead promoting a false birth date for the Messiah. Both sides have distorted the reality of history. So that is why we, as Talmudim of Yeshua, stand aside from both and embrace Hanukkah as a constant reminder that Yahweh is in control of all the affairs of humanity. That is the real answer to my question. Why do we, as Talmudim of Yeshua, celebrate Hanukkah? Shabbat Shalom.